In October 1886, her older sister Mary entered the same Carmelite monastery, adding to Therese's grief. The warm atmosphere at Les Buissonets, so necessary to her, was disappearing. Now only she and Céline remained with their father. Her frequent tears made some friends think she had a weak character, and the Guérins indeed share this opinion. Therese also suffered from scruples, a condition experienced by other saints such as Alphonsus Ligori, also a doctor of the church, and Ignatius Loyola, the founder of Jesuits. She wrote, "One would have to pass through this martyrdom to understand it well. And for me to express what I experienced for a year and a half would be impossible." Christmas Eve 1886 was a turning point in the life of Therese. She called it her complete conversion. Years later, she stated that on that night, she overcame the pressures she had faced since the death of her mother, and said that God worked a little miracle to make me go up in an instant. On that blessed night, Jesus, who saw fit to make himself a child out of love for me, saw fit to have me come forth from the swaddling clothes and imperfection of childhood. On Christmas Eve 1886, Louis Martin and his daughters Leonie, Céline, and Therese had attended the midnight mass at the cathedral in Lisieux. On December 1st of that year, Leonie, covered in eczema and hiding her hair under a short mantilla, had returned to Les Buissonets after just 7 weeks under the regime of the poor class in Alençon, and her sister were helping her get over her sense of failure and humiliation. Back at Les Buissonets, Therese, as was the custom for French children, had left her shoes on the hearth empty in anticipation of gifts, not from Father Christmas, but from the child Jesus, who was imagined to travel through the air bearing toys and cakes. While she was going up the stairs, she heard her father say to Céline, "Well, fortunately, this will be the last year for this." Therese began to cry, and Céline advised her not to go back downstairs immediately. Then, suddenly, Therese pulled herself together and wiped her tears. She ran down the stairs, knelt by the fireplace, and unwrapped her surprises as jubilantly as ever. In her account 9 years later, in 1895, she wrote, "In an instant, Jesus, content with my goodwill, accomplished the work I had not been able to do in 10 years. After 9 such years, she had recovered the strength of soul she had lost when her mother died, and she said she was to retain it forever. She discovered the joy in self-forgetfulness and added, I felt, in a word, charity enter my heart, the need to forget myself to make others happy. Since that blessed night, I have not been defeated in any battle, but instead I went from victory to victory and began to, so to speak, to run a giant's course." In May 1887, Therese approached her 63-year-old father Louis, who was recovering from a small stroke, while he sat in the garden one Sunday afternoon and told him that she wanted to celebrate the anniversary of her conversion by entering Carmel before Christmas. Louis and Therese both broke down and cried, but Louis got up, gently picked a little white flower, root intact, and gave it to her, explaining the care with which God brought it into being and preserved it until that day. Therese later wrote, "While I listened, I believe I was hearing my own story." To Therese, the flower seemed a symbol of herself. Therese then renewed her attempts to join the Carmel. But the priest superior of the monastery would not allow it on account of her youth. During summer, French newspapers were filled with the story of Henri Branzini, convicted of the brutal murder of 2 women and a child. To the outraged public, Branzini represents all that threaten the decent way of life in France. In July and August 1887, Therese prayed hard for the conversion of Branzini, so his soul could be saved. But Branzini showed no remorse. At the end of August, the newspapers reported that just as Branzini's neck was placed on the guillotine, he had grabbed a crucifix and kissed it 3 times. Therese was ecstatic and believed that her prayers had saved him. She continued to pray for Branzini after his death. In November 1887, Louis took Céline and Therese on a diocesan pilgrimage to Rome for the priestly jubilee of Pope Leo XIII. The young gods in the pilgrimage, bright and pretty, Therese did not go unnoticed. In Bologna, a student boldly jousted against her on purpose. On November 20, 1887, during a general audience with the Pope, an old man of 77, Therese, in her turn, approached him, kissed his slipper instead of his hand, and said, "Most Holy Father, I have a great favor to ask of you," and then asked his permission to enter the cloister at age 15. Later that evening, she wrote to Pauline, "The Pope is so old that you would think he is dead." The Pope replied, "Well, my child, do what the superiors decide, you will enter it, if it is God's will." And he blessed her. She refused to leave his feet, and the Swiss guard had to carry her out of the room. Soon after that, the Bishop of Bayeux authorized the prioress to receive Therese, and on April 9, 1888, she became a Carmelite postulant. In 1889, her father suffered a shock and was taken to a private sanatorium, the Bon Sauveur at Caen, where he remained for 3 years before returning to Lisieux in 1892. He died on July 29, 1894. Upon his death, Céline, who had been caring for him, entered the same Carmel as her 3 sisters on September 14, 1894. Their cousin, Mary Guerin, entered on August 15, 1895. Léonie, after several attempts, became Sister Françoise Therese, a nun in the Order of the Visitation of Holy Mary at Caen, where she died in 1941. The monastery Therese entered was not an old established house with a great tradition. In 1838, 2 nuns from the Poitiers Carmel had been sent out to found a house in Lisieux. One of them, Mother Genevieve of Saint Teresa, was still living when Therese entered. In fact, the second wing of the convent, containing the cells and sick rooms in which Therese was to live and die, had been standing only 10 years. What Therese found when she entered was a community of very aged nuns, some odd and swanky, some sick and troubled, some lukewarm and complacent. Almost all of the sisters came from the petty bourgeois and artisan class. The prioress and novice misters were of all Norman nobility. Probably the Martin sisters alone represent the new class of rising bourgeoisie. The Carmelite order had been reformed in 16th century by Therese of Avila. The times of silence and of solitude were many, but the founders had also planned time for work and relaxation in common, believing that the austerity of the life should not hinder sisterly and joyful relations. The Camel of Leisure in 1888 had 26 nuns from very different classes and backgrounds. For the majority of the life of Therese, the prioress would be Mother Mary de Gonzague, born Marie Adèle Rosalie Davy de Verville. When Therese entered the convent, Mother Mary was 54, a woman of changeable humor, who sometimes used her authority in a capricious manner. This had for effect a certain laxity in the observance of established rules. Therese's time as a postulant began on the Feast of Annunciation. She felt peace after she received communion that day and later wrote, At last my desires were realized, and I cannot describe the deep sweet peace which fueled my soul. This peace has remained with me during the 8.5 years of my life here and has never left me, even amid the greatest trials. From her childhood, Therese had dreamed of the desert to which God would someday lead her. Now she had entered that desert. Though she was now reunited with Mary and Pauline, from the first day she began her struggle to win and keep her distance from her sisters. Right at the start, Mary de Gonzague, the prioress, had turned the postulant Therese over to her eldest sister Mary, who was to teach her to follow the divine office. Later, she appointed Therese assistant to Pauline in the refectory. And when her cousin Mary Guerin also entered, she employed the two daughters in the sacristy. Therese adhered strictly to the rule which forbade all superfluous talk during work. She saw her sister together only in the hours of common recreation after meals. At such times, she would sit down beside whomever she happened to be near, or beside a nun whom she had observed to be downcast, disregarding the tacit and sometimes expressed sensitivity and even jealousy of her biological sisters. We must apologize to others for our being four under one roof. She was in the habit of remarking, When I am dead, you must be very careful not to lead the family life with one another. I did not come to Carmel to be with my sisters. On the contrary, I saw clearly that their presence would cost me dear. So I was determined not to give way to nature. Though the novice mistress, Sister Mary of the Angels, Jane de Chamontel, found Therese slow, the young postulant adapt well to her new environment. She wrote, "Illusion. The good Lord gave me the grace to have none on entering Carmel. I found religious life as I had figured. So no sacrifice astonished me. She sought above all to conform the rules and customs of the Carmelite that she learned each day. Later, when Therese had become assistant to the novice mistress, she repeated how important respect for the rule was. When any break the rule, this is not a reason to justify ourselves. Each must act as if the perfection of the order depends on her personal conduct. She also affirmed the essential role of obedience in religious life. When you stop watching the infallible compass of obedience, as quickly the mind wanders in arid lands where the water of grace is soon lacking. She chose a spiritual director, a Jesuit, Father Pichon. At their first meeting, she made a general confession, going back over all her past sins. She came away from it profoundly relieved. The priest, who had himself suffered from scruples, understood her and reassured her. A few months later, he left for Canada, and Therese would only be able to ask his advice by letter, and his replies were rare.